So good afternoon. We wanted to give everyone an extra minute or two to dial in. But my name is Andrew Southerling. Joining me today are Molly White and Louis Greenstein. Together we are the co-chairs of the McGuireWoods Securities Enforcement and Litigation Group. Molly is in LA and anchors our West Coast practice. Louis and I are in DC. All of us served much of our careers at the SEC in the Division of Enforcement. We are delighted to welcome you to today's presentation where we will discuss what to expect in SEC and FINRA enforcement going forward in 2020. Today's discussion is part of our broader McGuireWoods Wednesday afternoon summer series entitled What to Expect, a look to the future where our McGuireWoods teams will be engaging with the industry and our clients on topical regulatory issues. Following today, we will be hosting webinars on other key areas of interest, including what to expect in governance of markets post-CAT implementation, what to expect in customer arbitrations and litigation, and what to expect in the initial stages of regulation best interest. So, as we all know, COVID-19 has caused a lot of disruption in our personal lives, in the economy, our financial markets, and of course on how our chief regulators, the SEC and FINRA, are moving forward with examinations, investigations, and enforcement actions in litigation. So Molly, Louis, and I thought it would be useful to share with you today our insight on the current state of play of SEC and FINRA enforcement, the impacts the pandemic is having on their enforcement programs, and how we see the remainder of 2020 shaping up. So for today's presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about the 2019 enforcement statistics, some recent events impacting enforcement, which include the Kokesh and Liu Supreme Court decisions, maybe a potential lineup change on the commission, which is always interesting to talk about, to see how that impacts enforcement. FINRA's newly heightened focus on cooperation and transparency, particularly in their AWC process. The SEC and FINRA's enforcement outlooks included COVID-19 related efforts and enforcement priorities, COVID-19 related enforcement actions, and the Paycheck protection program and some of the issues we're seeing there, particularly with respect to secondary market sales and investment advisor disclosures regarding the program. So let's talk for a few seconds about some enforcement metrics. I think it's always good to give a little context of the enforcement environment current based on prior years. So taking a look at the SEC's enforcement metrics, so last year, fiscal year, they did 862 enforcement actions, which was a slight uptick from 2018. They obtained $4.3 billion in penalties and disgorgement. That's an important metric there, particularly the disgorgement metric, which we'll discuss a little bit later on how the Supreme Court decisions will impact that number, likely will cause it to go down. $3.2 billion, the $3.2 billion in disgorgement is the highest figure in 10 years. For FINRA, they had 854 actions, which is down from 2018 and actually reflects a little bit of a downward trend in enforcement cases brought. They obtained $39.5 million in fines, which was also down, but I think the important statistic is, at least as far as FINRA is concerned, is the $27.9 million in restitution, which is up from 2018, and FINRA has made restitution a top priority. Regulators, as to enforcement efforts in the pandemic era, we'll call it, the SEC and FINRA have both made clear that investigations and enforcement efforts are continuing in full force despite COVID-19. However, they really have taken different approaches in how they are moving forward, particularly with respect to the taking of testimony for witnesses. Each, I think, of the regulators recognize, as we do in the industry, that remote testimony is not ideal at all. And we all are sort of recognizing the need for good faith accommodations and negotiations, and that those things are really necessary and actually inspected as part of the testimony taking process if that's going to go at all smoothly. So it really is clear that advancing investigations remotely remains a work in progress. But I do think that the regulators and us in the industry are coming to terms that this is going to be the new normal for probably potentially a good while. In fact, the SEC has actually signaled that they don't intend to return to in-person testimony before mid-fall, if even then. So I think this is the new normal for a while. As to FINRA, let's talk a little bit about their efforts. The staff, they've noted that they are pretty well positioned for remote testimony, and they've been using the Zoom application for testimony. Here, we understand that many of the staff actually have been working across offices for a while as part of the reorganization, and work from home technology has been tested. So the FINRA staff seems actually pretty nimble with tech and very comfortable with Zoom. In fact, FINRA has taken 160 OTRs since March, which is a big number. In terms of working with counsel, FINRA staff has been willing to do a practice run in advance of testimony so that everybody can get comfortable with the platform. Sometimes they'll demonstrate to counsel how to have a private conversation with their client offline using the application. As to the testimony itself, they use a share screen to share docs and to show docs, which the staff controls. Although up until now, they've been reluctant, if at all, to share exhibits in advance of the OTR. I think it's kind of a little bit of an issue. As to the SEC, they actually have taken a slightly different approach than FINRA, sort of a more wait-and-see, cautious approach. They actually initially implemented a pilot program, which was pretty much voluntary, with some testimony to establish, a baseline of best practices. The SEC doesn't use Zoom, they use WebEx, which is a different platform. It's a little more clunky. There are no breakout rooms. So as counsel, if you want to talk to your client, you need to set up a different line. But with respect to the SEC, there seems to be a real willingness by the staff to reach good faith accommodations with counsel and witnesses, particularly in areas where the SEC normally has not been willing to negotiate. For example, they have shown some flexibility in sharing docs in advance of testimony in some circumstances. They're willing to shorten testimony and divide the testimony out over several days. I think everyone recognizes that it's really hard for a witness and even us, counsel, to stare at screens all day. Scrolling through a document is particularly difficult to look at it, scroll through it, and then give testimony on it. They're willing to provide more breaks and actually permitting counsel to talk with clients more than usual during the testimony. So I think those are all good things, and a lot of the SEC testimony is really moving forward voluntarily. But I would say perhaps that doesn't matter so much, because I do think in the bigger context, the staff has a compelling need in the public interest to move forward with investigations. So, voluntary or not, forcing the staff to move to enforce the subpoena probably would not be a fruitful effort by defense counsel. But we are now beginning to see an uptick in testimony. And as I mentioned a short while ago, there are some very significant downsides and limitations to defending testimony remotely, but I do think that many of us are finding it okay, particularly if you can get some good faith concessions and accommodations on how the testimony is going to proceed. Moving slides here, we want to talk a little bit about some topics of interest, some real interesting things happening right now. Let's talk a little bit about disgorgement. This is a very hot and timely topic, particularly in light of the Supreme Court decisions in Kokesh and Liu. So as to disgorgement, is one available remedy, and a very powerful one for the SEC in enforcement actions. And in the two recent Supreme Court decisions, we see that the court has imposed, we think, some significant limitations on the timing in which the SEC may obtain disgorgement and the scope of what it may actually obtain in disgorgement. And I think these will have a profound effect on the enforcement program. So The first case was Kokesh versus the SEC, and that decision was handed down in 2017. That case dealt with disgorgement and the statute of limitations for penalties. You may recall that the Supreme Court found that the manner in which the SEC sought and obtained disgorgement confirmed that disgorgement actually constituted a civil penalty, and therefore that the 5-year statute of limitations for civil penalties in federal court actions applied also to disgorgement sought by the SEC of a wrongdoer's ill-gotten gains. And thus, since Kokesh, the SEC's ability to obtain disgorgement has been confined to a 5-year window, and the impact of that has been over time that we've seen the SEC in many cases seeking tolling agreements really early in the investigation process in order to preserve its ability to obtain disgorgement. But one thing that the Supreme Court and Kokesh left over was an issue that they raised and left an open question whether and to what extent the SEC had authority to seek disgorgements in federal court actions, even in the first instance. And that set the table for Liu. The Liu decision was in June of 2020, actually June 22nd. And in Liu, the Supreme Court answered that question. Here, the Supreme Court held that disgorgement, when properly tailored, was an equitable remedy available to the SEC in federal court actions. In Liu, the Supreme Court then went on to craft a rule that properly tailored disgorgement means that disgorgement may not exceed a wrongdoer's net profits, and monies disgorged from wrongdoers must be returned to victims. So sort of a two-pronged test there. It sounds kind of simple, actually, but it's not really. And that's because the Supreme Court left open 3 critical questions to the lower courts to decide in determining what actually constitutes proper disgorgement. So how do we arrive at proper disgorgement? The Supreme Court first said to the lower courts that they must decide how to determine net profits of a fraudulent scheme and what expenses may be deducted to arrive at net profit. Second, whether funds subject to disgorgement must be returned to victims in every case, okay, or whether and under what circumstances may those funds be deposited with the Treasury. And third, under what circumstances can a defendant be ordered to disgorge another's ill-gotten gains. And so these 2 decisions, I think, will really have a significant impact on SEC investigations and enforcement decisions, and here's why. Among other things, first, there's going to be no doubt great debate in many cases over what constitutes legitimate expenses. For example, what if a business's entire profit was the result of a fraudulent scheme? Also, what happens where victims of the scheme are not readily known or identifiable? For example, that's often the case in FCPA actions and in insider trading cases where you can't really find individual victims, or at least they're hard to identify. What happens in insider trading cases, which, insider trading cases make up a huge part of the SEC's enforcement docket year over year. And their disgorgement number, turns a lot on what they're able to uncover obtain in insider trading cases. So what do you do where the SEC routinely seeks disgorgement from tippers of all ill-gotten gains obtained from downstream tippees? Would that process convert proper disgorgement into out-of-bounds disgorgement or into an impermissible penalty? Also, what happens in an administrative proceeding? The Liu decision only dealt with federal court actions. So will the SEC perhaps have the ability to obtain greater disgorgement in administrative proceedings? Will there be different standards applied in those proceedings? And finally, what about the 5-year statute of limitations for disgorgement as determined in Kokesh? Will that continue to apply even to properly tailored disgorgement under the rule crafted in Liu? And so I think all of these are legitimate questions and exercises and inquiries that both counsel and the SEC staff are going to have to undertake and engage in a dialogue throughout the course of an investigation, particularly when the investigations are coming to close and perhaps a settlement is being discussed. And so I do think that we're going to see a lot of action here on the disgorgement front. Another fun topic, it's always useful to examine is, what happens when the commission changes. It's always a fun exercise in examining how the makeup of the commission impacts enforcement. Perhaps many on our call today have seen reports that SEC Chairman Jay Clayton may be headed to the Southern District of New York as U.S. Attorney. Now, I don't know if that's likely or unlikely. Maybe unlikely at this point, but who knows? But it does raise, the important question and issue of, what the makeup of the commission could look like when Chair Clayton leaves. And from an enforcement perspective, that's important. So what if we have a Chair Hester Peirce? Commissioner Peirce to start. If Chair Clayton were to leave before the election, she would become acting chair. If President Trump is reelected, then many believe she is the leading candidate to be chair. And we know a lot about Commissioner Peirce and her views on enforcement. She's been on the commission a good while, and even before her service on the commission, she was quite active with respect to voicing her thoughts and concerns about the enforcement program. And we know that she's made clear that she's not a fan of broken windows enforcement. She doesn't like rulemaking by enforcement. She does not believe that the SEC is an enforcement agency, but thinks it's a regulatory agency. She's clearly not driven by statistics. We know that in viewing potential enforcement actions, she seems to be much more focused on whether the action is a wise use of staff resources, whether the violation is meaningful, or whether the matter could be handled by the examination staff or through rulemaking. She's also talked about whether the enforcement action would undermine good faith efforts of compliance officers, which I think is a valid point, and push the bounds of SEC authority or impose costs on shareholders unnecessarily. So I think with a Chair Peirce, we might expect a more regulatory approach to enforcement than we've seen in the past. Focus more on compliance and less on enforcement to solve problems, which would be quite different than what we've seen, I think, over the last two chairs. Now, Commissioner Lee, Allison Lee, she's new. She's a Democrat nominee. She's only been serving on the commission for about a year, so we don't know really much, if anything, about her view of enforcement, but we do know where she comes from. And she served as counsel to former Commissioner Kara Stein. She was also in the Division of Enforcement, and she also was a special prosecutor. So we know she does have an enforcement background, and we also know that she's been informed by Kara Stein. So I suppose if you liked Commissioner Stein, chances are you'd like a Chair Lee. But at a minimum, with a Chair Lee, the industry would be overseen by a chair who is relatively new to the commission. To round out the commission, Caroline Crenshaw has been put forward as a Democratic nominee, and she's set to appear before the Senate Banking Committee next week. She's paired with Commissioner Peirce, actually, who's being nominated for a second term. Ms. Crenshaw, like Commissioner Lee, previously worked for Commissioner Stein and also worked for Commissioner Robert Jackson. She also worked in OC at the SEC and was counsel in the Division of Investment Management. So she's got a pretty strong SEC background, but again, probably more in the Kara Stein camp, sort of like Lee. So again, if you like Commissioner Stein, then you likely like the combination of Lee and Crenshaw on the commission. So it's interesting to see how that may play out. Of course, there may be a new chair, someone new altogether nominated, and we'll have to see what that looks like. One other thing of our area of interest I'd like to highlight is cooperation and privilege. This is an important topic from an enforcement perspective, and one that FINRA in particular has been focusing on. The virtues of cooperation is always a key consideration for us, for firms and counsel, before the SEC or FINRA launches an investigation or even after an investigation has begun. And FINRA recently has been highly focused on principles of cooperation and on being transparent in its settlement documents, its AWCs, in an effort so that the industry can better learn what constitutes extraordinary or credit-worthy cooperation. All this, I think, is a good thing, although I think we see the cooperation bar sort of being raised. FINRA also back in July of 2019, so almost a year ago, put out its notice to members, regulatory notice 19-23, which supplemented its prior guidance, which had been issued all the way back in 2008. So it had been a long time coming on some clarity on what constitutes extraordinary cooperation in the FINRA context. With respect to FINRA, there's always a natural tension between required cooperation under Rules 8210 and 4530 and what constitutes extraordinary cooperation, which can result in a decision by FINRA not to bring an enforcement action, zero fine, or perhaps a reduced fine or other type of relief. I think our best guidance at this point is to look at two recent settlements as examples of the kind of guidance that firms can see with respect to cooperation and FINRA's efforts to make cooperation credit more transparent. Again, all good things. I think as an overarching matter, FINRA has made clear that it expects cooperation to be complete and total in order for the firm to receive credit. So let me just touch briefly on these two cases, and then I'm going to turn it over to Louis. But the first case was in December 2019, and it involved the suitability of rep recommendations to customers related to rollovers of unit investment trusts. That settlement contained a separate section called Credit for Extraordinary Cooperation, which FINRA is making a point to put in to its settlements. And according to the settlement, the member firm received credit in light of its substantial assistance to the investigation, which included retaining an outside consultant. I think that's a big piece. And then voluntarily sharing the results of the consultant's efforts with FINRA, and then identifying the customers eligible for restitution and voluntarily implementing corrective measures, all prior to intervention by FINRA. And again, I think restitution, FINRA has made clear that they are really focused on firms' efforts to get restitution to injured customers. The second case was a settlement just here in June 2020, very recent. It involved the failure of a firm to provide customer accounts with mutual fund sales charge waivers and fee rebates. Here, also in the separate section, credit for extraordinary cooperation, the firm received credit and in this case, importantly, no penalty in light of engaging an outside consultant to identify disadvantaged customers and to calculate remediation. The firm promptly established a plan of remediation, notified customers, and began to pay restitution to affected customers promptly. The firm remediated supervisory deficiencies and also provided substantial assistance to the staff. And I'd also point out that if you take a look at Regulatory Notice 1923, FINRA permits firms in appropriate circumstances to receive cooperation even where corrective measures and or restitution occurs after the firm reports to FINRA, which is, I think, a little bit of a departure from the 2008 guidance. So, the takeaway here, I think the bar for cooperation appears to be rising, but at least we're getting the kind of a blueprint from FINRA that we need so we can really put into action early in investigations a plan aimed at achieving extraordinary cooperation. And so with that, I'm going to turn over the slides to Louis to talk a little bit more about SEC and FINRA enforcement priorities.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to everyone for taking time out of your day to join us. It's great to see so many familiar names on the attendee list, and I hope that we'll have a chance to start seeing each other in person, not just over Zoom in the short term. So notwithstanding these unprecedented and challenging times, as Andrew made clear, both SEC and FINRA enforcement are open for business. Additionally, the SEC and FINRA have really stepped up to lead the way by doing more than just investigating. They've both been very proactive in sharing their enforcement priorities, what they're seeing and what they're focusing on to fulfill their investor protection missions. Some of the more noteworthy and formative efforts in this regard are listed on this current slide. I'm not going to bore you with the details of each and every one of these, and I'll cover some of the salient aspects of this guidance as it pertains to enforcement priorities shortly. But just very briefly, an excellent overview of the SEC's and FINRA's efforts to continue to regulate effectively in the face of the current environment was provided both in Co-Director Pekin's keynote address at the Securities Forum West, as well as in a SIFMA webcast in which senior FINRA enforcement personnel, including Enforcement Head Jessica Hopper, participated. If you haven't had a chance to either attend these or read any of the materials on it, in your materials from today, you should have a detailed synthesis that we prepared on the enforcement and regulatory guidance provided in these remarks. Another great resource on FINRA's priorities can be found in the June 12th virtual conference panel on enforcement initiatives, developments, and priorities that the top FINRA enforcement officials participated in. And this is another one, if you haven't watched, it's worth the time. And then on the SEC enforcement and regulatory fronts, you can find additional insight in the March 23rd statement by co-directors Stephanie Avakian and Steve Pekin on insider trading, as well as in Chair Clayton and CorpFin Director William Hinman's statement on disclosures as part of the fight against COVID-19. Going to the next slide. With regard to the enforcement guidance, the co-director's statement concerning market integrity and insider trading re-emphasized the SEC commitment to safeguard the integrity of our financial markets. The statement leaves no question of how critical it is under current market conditions to control the potential receipt and misuse of non-public information. The risk of this is, of course, not new. However, current conditions certainly create additional opportunities for access to material non-public information, as well as, some might say, added temptations to trade on the basis of that information. Without question, there's a significant increase in the flow of highly market-moving information given current circumstances. This information might include that relating to delayed earnings reports and filings due to COVID, efforts by certain companies to develop a vaccine. In this regard, I would note that just this morning, markets soared at the open after Moderna said its vaccine under development produced finding antibodies during a phase 1 trial and that they would move on to a clinical trial this month. Other types of such information concern quicker and more reliable testing, better and more affordable PPE, as well as legislative and other government attempts to address the pandemic, the direct impact on issuers' businesses as a result of that, as well as the indirect impacts on businesses due to disruptions that they're facing, disruptions in supply chains, the availability of raw materials, and changes to phases of reopening plans and quarantine requirements that we're seeing pop up all over the country now. The risks of dealing with this information are exacerbated by the remote working environment, and given the uncertainty, both health and financial, that many are facing, there are certainly potential temptations out there. So what does this really all mean for the industry? Just a couple takeaways on that. In addition to complying with existing policies and procedures designed to prevent the misuse of material non-public information, firms should take steps to train and retrain employees, as well as revisit and retest policies and procedures to make sure they're operating as intended in light of current realities. Examples of this could include ensuring the effectiveness of walls or other barriers in place in order to segment the flow and prevent the misuse of information, and making sure that watch and restricted lists are kept current, and enhancing trading reviews. Some of the other guidance provided by the SEC, at the same time that it was recognizing the increased risk for disclosures to the marketplace, for the increased risk for the misuse of material non-public information, the SEC urged additional disclosures to the marketplace by both corporate and municipal issuers, which of course increased potential opportunities for the access to and flow and potential misuse of material non-public information. Examples of this can be found in Chair Clayton and Hinman's statement on April the 8th, where they urged public companies and their disclosures to provide as much information as practical regarding their current financial and operating status, as well as their future operating and financial planning. They do in the statement acknowledge the challenges of forward-looking disclosures, and as a result, the statement encourages issuers to utilize applicable safe harbors. Following this statement, which was targeted to public companies, Chair Clayton and Rebecca Olson, who's the Director of Municipal Securities, issued a similar statement for municipal issuers. While noting the differences between corporate and municipal issuers, the statement stressed the overarching need for high-quality disclosure, particularly in the current period of financial stress and uncertainty. And in recognition of the challenges of developing voluntary disclosures under current market conditions, the statement requested municipal issuers to provide robust, timely, and accurate information to the market. In addition to this guidance, both the SEC and FINRA have been very active in disseminating information to broker-dealers and investors about various fraud risks. Examples of this include an April 10th SEC investor bulletin regarding frauds targeting Main Street investors. The bulletin makes clear that the SEC is actively monitoring markets for frauds, illicit schemes, and other misconduct affecting investors regarding COVID-19. And as Molly will discuss in a bit, how the SEC will not hesitate to issue trading suspensions and use its enforcement tools as appropriate. Also, later in June, the SEC issued an alert warning for investors to be on the lookout for fraudsters and other bad actors targeting retirement savings. And that's a common issue that has existed, since the beginning of time. But, the new wrinkle to this, the targeting of retirement savings, has been heightened as a result of, as you all know, the CARES Act permits withdrawals up to $100,000 under certain circumstances. So fraudsters are, out there looking to incentivize people or get them to take money out of their retirement plans. FINRA, for its part, has put out several notices highlighting fraud risks, including alerts focused on how to avoid investment scams and advising broker-dealers and their associated persons to be aware of and take appropriate measures to address increased risk and challenges. One of the increased risks and challenges that they cite is that in a fraudulent account opening and money transfers. And this is particularly true for firms that have just recently starting to offer such services as a result of their need to move operations to a remote environment. Both FINRA and the SEC have also, taken steps to ensure better collaboration and organization within their organizations. The SEC, for its part, formed a steering committee, and FINRA, for its part, has a COVID task force. The SEC steering committee that is comprised of 24 leaders from enforcement, including the Office of Market Intelligence and Market Abuse, and the Microcap Fraud Task Force. And the goal of this is to rapidly gather information and monitor trading activity and identify suspicious activity. In addition to coordinating within the SEC, the committee is also responsible for coordinating with other federal agencies, state securities regulators, the securities exchanges, SROs like FINRA, to ensure coordinated response that protects investors. Next slide. In describing how they're prioritizing enforcement efforts and resources, both the SEC and FINRA have pointed to the use of data analytics to drive their efforts. And turning to some of the specific products and issues of enforcement interest, one issue that we see to look out for on the horizon is around enforcement of Regulation BI, now that that is in effect. In the SIFMA webinar in May that I had referenced earlier, Barry Havlick suggested that FINRA examiners will not take a hardline approach until next year. And with respect to enforcement, EVP Hopper indicated that it would follow the lead of the examination staff and that enforcement actions in the first 6 months will be in areas where FINRA previously would have brought an action for suitability obligations, such as churning and excessive trading. And while this sounds completely reasonable and not unexpected, I do think we're likely to see a significant increase in excessive trading and churning enforcement actions, including perhaps actions that are a bit more aggressive or push the boundaries that FINRA previously might not have pursued. So in this regard, during the virtual panel back on June that I had referenced in the previous slides, the Deputy Head of Enforcement, Chris Kelly, described Reg BI as a, quote, game changer for actions involving churning and excessive trading. And he went on to explain his view of this, that this is because historically the most difficult element to establish for such claims is data control. So with that now removed, so long as there's a recommendation, he said, we can expect to see FINRA pursue churning and excessive trading cases with increased frequency and vigor. Additionally, Reg BI raises the risk of enforcement scrutiny in connection with the addition of account recommendations as falling into scope as recommendations concerning investment strategy and securities. And what this means is that making a determination as to the type of account you're offering and recommending to a customer is within the scope of the regulation. So if you have various accounts, for example, IRAs, brokerage accounts, wrap fee accounts, you would need to assess whether there's a reasonable basis to offer a particular account to your customer and take into account the types of products that are offered, the cost structure, the investment profile of the customer, and all the other things that you would take into account in assessing whether there's a reasonable basis for the recommendation. So if you're not already doing this, member firms will be well served to focus on this change. Relating to suitability and supervision, FINRA will also be focusing on brokers' recommendations to investors to trade on margin. According to FINRA, we should expect to see some enforcement actions around this in the coming year. And this isn't surprising, as it was in an exam priority in 2018. But as they look into these issues, the questions being asked around this would include whether or not the customer understands how margin works. Do they understand the risk given current volatility that they might be subject to a margin call with little or no notice or face forced sales? Do they understand that in the event of a forced sale, it could occur during periods of extreme volatility or market dislocation? They'll also be looking at and asking questions around what are the products that customers are purchasing on margin. There have been some instances noted in which register reps were recommending that customers buy on margin with interest rates of about 10 to 12% in order to go and purchase fixed income investments that yield 4%. So, these are the sort of issues I think we can expect to see them focusing on with regards to supervision and margin trading. Another focus for both FINRA and the SEC is complex financial instruments. We typically see an increase in complex financial instruments in uncertain market times like we have now. And oftentimes, these instruments look very attractive, in particular for investors who might be on fixed incomes. But there's a lot of questions around them, in particular regarding how they're being sold. Do the registered reps understand how the products actually work in different market conditions? They might understand how they work in the current market condition, but what if, trends go a different way? How does it work? Is the training of the sales of these products sufficient to ensure that they understand the product's operation? Are they communicating this to their customers so that they understand how the products work? Do the customers understand that the prospect of high returns in many of these products also has a high risk of loss? And more importantly, in the design and mapping of these products, do they work as intended and marketed in all market conditions? If there's this extreme change in interest rates, is it going to operate the way it was intended, and are the systems set up for it to work the way that it's being marketed? Also, these products often have unique features that, such as attractive teaser rates or floors, that can sound attractive in the face of current uncertainty, but are they understood and explained correctly? During the June virtual panel, Terrence Bowen spoke about FINRA's focus on one such product, that's steepeners. Steepeners, those are structured notes that are typically reserved for sophisticated investors, and FINRA is seen more and more targeted to retail clients. In the current environment, they're appealing because they produce income, often with high teaser rates, and they have the principal protected. But, and of course, if something sounds like it might be too good to be true, there's always a but. And the but with respect to steepeners is that they have long maturities and are illiquid, and there is no secondary market for them. So principal protection is an attractive feature for sure, but do the retail investors understand the lack of liquidity options, and are these characteristics consistent with their investment risk profile? And last but not least, noted previously, both the SEC and FINRA remain focused on insider trading. The reports out of both agencies is that there's an uptick in potential insider trading cases. As you probably all recall, in March, news outlets reported that issued reports about U.S. senators selling millions of dollars of stock following classified briefings on the threat of COVID-19 outbreaks. And it was 3 days after these reports that the co-director statement from Ovakian and Pekin came out, reminding market participants of their obligations with respect to material non-public information and the SEC's resolve to protect investors from fraud and ensure market integrity. With almost everyone working remotely, the rapid flow of this potentially market-moving information through non-traditional communication channels and the professional and personal uncertainty facing most, if not all, market participants, it creates an increased risk of an atmosphere that causes people with access to MMPI to engage in riskier behavior. I'm now going to turn it back over to Andrew so he can discuss some of the other enforcement priorities that we're seeing.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Louis. That was really terrific. Just touch on a couple other things quickly. Protection of retail investors. Also, a big SEC enforcement priority, as we all know, under Chair Clayton. And here, municipal securities is always a key enforcement priority, and with a particularly keen focus on disclosures. We could probably spend our entire program discussing municipal securities and the Commission's enforcement efforts and regulatory efforts in this regard. But disclosure to retail investors has always been, extremely important topic for the SEC, in particular with respect to fixed income and munis. Disclosures and transparency, particularly pre-trade transparency, have been a focus going all the way back, you may recall, to the 2012 report on municipal securities, and recently a topic at FinSec, that's the Fixed Income Market Structure Advisory Committee meetings. And as Louis has pointed out now, Chair Clayton and OMS Director Olson have issued, I think, a very important statement on the importance of municipal market disclosures back in May, where they emphasized the need for issuers of municipal securities to make high-quality disclosures to investors, including current financial and operating information, but also, interestingly, forward-looking information regarding the impact of COVID as is practicable. And that's something that has always been debated for a long time in the muni space, the issue of forward-looking information. But I think even perhaps more importantly for purposes of our discussion today, Chair Clayton and Director Olson encouraged financial professionals to consider the extent of such disclosures, that's issuer disclosures, when providing recommendations and investment advice to mainstream investors. And so it looks like they're signaling an obligation on professionals to make sure, or to at least do some diligence on what actually is being disclosed. I think we'll see the regulators taking a good look at trading platforms and sales reps' disclosures to see whether retail investors are being provided with adequate pre-sale information. And I suspect that at some point we'll see inquiries regarding underwriters' due diligence with respect to COVID-19 disclosures. and whether they are key representations in offering materials. Best execution, this is a particular FINRA priority. I thought it was an interesting one to flag. In particular, the zero commission model. And here, FINRA has been looking at firms that offer zero commissions, and FINRA has been looking at potential conflicts of interest and quality of customer service related to that model. FINRA has issued several targeted exam letters to firms on this practice and is focused on what firms are doing by way of their regular and rigorous reviews of order routing practices and execution quality. I would just highlight a recent settlement involving Robinhood in December 2019, so not pretty recent. I think it's a very good example of FINRA's efforts here and what they're looking at, what they're expecting of firms. In this settlement, the firm had offered, or in this case rather, the firm had offered customers the ability to trade in equity securities without being charged commissions. So there's the zero commission model. But the firm, whereas it initially first routed all of its orders to its clearing broker, it later transitioned to routing orders away from its clearing broker and began routing orders primarily to other broker-dealers to provide execution services, and those other firms all paid the firm for this order flow. FINRA found that the firm did not exercise reasonable diligence to ascertain whether these broker-dealers provided the best market for its customers to receive the best execution quality as compared to other venues. And thus, even though the firm offered commission-free trading to its customers, it nevertheless received compensation for that trading through payment for order flow. As we're aware, broker-dealers are not permitted to allow a payment or inducement for order flow to interfere with its efforts to obtain best X. And so I think here FINRA is taking a look at firms to ensure that customers receive the same execution quality and the same quality of service for the trades, even though the firm is not receiving a commission. So we expect to see some action there. With that, I'm going to flip it to Molly out on the West Coast. Molly?
Great. Thanks. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the increased activity that we've seen with respect to whistleblowers. I think, not surprisingly, in the wake of COVID-19, we've seen increased whistleblower activity. It's likely, at least in part, due to the market volatility that we saw earlier this year. And just to remind everyone, I'm sure everyone on the call is aware of it, but March of 2020 marked the end to the longest running bull market for U.S. equities. And in February, in February, we saw the Dow Jones Industrials decline 38.3% from the high in February to its lowest point in March. That's the third largest month-over-month decline in history, trailing only the Great Depression and Black Monday in 1987. So, not surprisingly, with all of this volatility, we saw a lot of whistleblower tips come into the SEC. So from mid-March to mid-May 2020, the SEC staff triaged more than 4,000 whistleblower tips. That's a 35% increase over the same period in 2019. And so similarly, we've seen some of the most significant whistleblower rewards being paid in fiscal year 2020. In fact, 1/3 of the top 10 whistleblower rewards that we've seen since 2011 were paid in April and June of this year. In addition, more than 20% of all whistleblower rewards were paid in fiscal year 2020. So to date, the SEC has paid more than $100 million to 17 whistleblowers in fiscal year 2020, thus encouraging whistleblower activity. Next slide, please. Next, we're going to pivot a little bit to the guidance and the indications that we've heard the leaders of SEC and FINRA giving to look at some of what we've actually seen the SEC doing. And the first thing I want to talk about are trading suspensions. One interesting development has been an uptick in the SEC's use of trading suspensions. I think, as many of you know, this is one of the many tools that the SEC has in its toolkit. And I think usually what we're accustomed to seeing is a handful of trading suspensions in every quarter. And then, of course, they increase in the third quarter of the year, which happens to coincide with the end of the SEC fiscal year when the SEC happens to be bringing a lot of 12J proceedings to revoke the stocks of companies that seem to be inactive. You also see a lot of trading suspensions in that period of time. So that's sort of the normal pattern. However, after the start of the pandemic this year, the SEC used its power to suspend the trading in securities of 49 different companies. 30 of those trading suspensions were related to COVID. And when I say they're related to COVID, I mean that basically companies were making statements about their ability to, I don't know, manufacture N95 masks or develop COVID-related products that were outlandish and seemed false on their face. And so the SEC, in conjunction with its power under 12K, determined it was in the public interest to suspend trading of those securities. I think probably one of the more interesting suspensions was the suspension related to Zoom. There was some confusion in the market. There are two different companies, one Zoom Technologies, which is a Chinese company that claims to engage in the manufacture and development and sale of electronic and telecom products, versus Zoom Video Communications, which is the Zoom that so many of us have become reliant upon. And so basically the price of Zoom, the Chinese company, ran from approximately $10 per share to $35 per share in 2 trading days. The SEC realized that there was some confusion about this and invoked the trading suspension. At any rate, I thought it's interesting to note that in the wake of the pandemic and a lot of market disruption, the SEC relied very heavily on that particular tool in its toolkit. Next slide. In addition, I wanted to just discuss briefly some of the enforcement actions that we've seen related to COVID. It's notable that the SEC has brought 3 cases involving disclosures against issuers. The 3 that I list here all relate to various statements, generally in press releases, that have to do with the company's ability to either manufacture products that are helpful in the battle against COVID or prepare tests. In all, the SEC brought 3 disclosure cases since the beginning of April. And then in addition, on the next slide, you'll see that the SEC also brought 2 additional enforcement actions that are COVID related. Basically, they were pump and dump schemes that involved, again, companies that purported to have involvement with products or tests that could be used in relation to COVID. And I mention all of these. Well, most of these 5 actions relate to penny stocks, and I think I would term them sort of low-hanging fruit. In other words, the statements that they were making in their press releases were pretty easy to determine that they were not accurate. I do think, based upon the filing of these 5 cases and what they indicate, is that it's likely that the SEC is going to be investigating and bringing additional COVID-related cases related to disclosures and potential manipulation of the market based upon the pandemic. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Paycheck Protection Program and what we're seeing there. So I think another area where we do expect to see increased SEC enforcement activity is in connection with the Paycheck Protection Program. And I'm sure people are aware that there's already a lot of litigation over the PPP loans, and I think that's an indication, given the number of class actions and other actions that have been brought, that there's going to be regulatory inquiries that follow. Just on a high level, some of the background: the Paycheck Protection Program, or the PPP, was established by the CARES Act. It was enacted at the end, or I believe the beginning of April, end of March, and it allows small businesses with funds to pay up to 24 weeks of payroll costs and some other things that they can spend the money for. And up to 100% of the loans are eligible for forgiveness by the Small Business Administration to the extent that proceeds were used during the covered period for forgivable purposes. So I think, as many of you are also aware, the CARES Act was enacted quickly and without many formal regulations. Folks were trying to figure out how the program would work based upon FAQs and interim final regulations. So it was a very, I think, uncertain time initially. And in addition, on June 5th, 2020, the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act was also enacted, and it retroactively revised several key terms of the PPP program. So the end result is that we have a morass of laws and interim final regulations that are difficult to navigate, which makes the PPP program fertile ground for regulatory inquiries. One of the things that we've already seen is on May 14, 2020, Reuters reported that the SEC is conducting a sweep of public companies. These are basically issuers that had announced they had received funds from PPP loans. And the inquiry relates to those companies' qualifications to receive the PPP loans. So in order to be eligible for the loan, a company has to certify in good faith that it needs the loan basically to respond to issues created by COVID-19 pandemic. And so what happened is the SEC appears to be questioning whether these public companies really needed the loan or made that certification in good faith. One of the interesting wrinkles is that the SBA has enacted a safe harbor provision and basically has said that for loans of less than $2 million, the SBA will assume that they applied for the loan in good faith. And basically that means that the SBA is not likely to review loans that were made for less than $2 million. It doesn't necessarily mean that the SEC would recognize the $2 million safe harbor as a safe harbor, so it's an interesting wrinkle, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Another interesting question is whether there will be any activity related to the secondary market. PPP loans are a form of loan under the SBA Section 7A, and they can be sold on the secondary market. So it'll be interesting to see whether there's any regulatory interest in looking at those sales of loans. And it's kind of one of the other interesting things is that the SBA only allows PPP loans to be sold to folks who've already been regulated by the SBA. So I think that while we may see some activity in that area, I don't think that it's going to be a huge area of concern. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the investment advisor disclosures. Really interesting note is the SEC's Division of Investment Management updated its COVID-19 FAQ guidance. And there was a question basically from a small advisory firm stating that they met the requirements of the PPP and they had applied for a PPP loan and they wanted to know what the regulatory reporting obligations were under the 40 Act. And basically the Division of Investment Management said that the registered investment advisor had to make full and fair disclosure to your clients of all material facts relating to the advisory relationship. If the circumstances leading you to seek a PP loan or other type of financial assistance constitute material facts relating to your advisory relationship with clients, it's the staff's view that your firm should provide disclosure of the nature and the amounts and effects of such assistance. So I think that this was a pretty vivid signal from the Division of Investment Management that those RIAs who have taken PPP loans need to disclose them. And again, we think that this is another likely area that we will see the SEC and FINRA taking an active interest in regulating. So with that, we conclude our presentation. I'd like to just thank everybody for attending today. If you have any questions, I know we've run out of time for Q&A, but please feel free to reach out to Andrew, Lewis, or myself.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.